Move over here. Do you have to follow?
You're fine. You're fine.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Thomas, for your introduction. And I hope for another 30 years. Well, we have to stay healthy, I think, for that. Before I begin my lecture, I would like to tell you a little story. It actually sounds like a made-up story, but it happened. It really is true. When I flew in from Frankfurt yesterday to Houston, I had to do what everyone has to do. You have to go through immigration, right? The people who have, I think, one of the most boring jobs, sitting there looking at passports all day long, but at the same time they have a lot of power because they can reject people like me. They can say, well, you have to go back. We don't want you here because you seem to be a person who does not want to do the things that we want you to do here. So it's always a little bit anxiety involved when I speak to an immigration officer, because I used to smuggle ham for friends 20 years ago, I guess, and they may find out. This time, the person asked me, the immigration officer asked me again, so what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm going on to Santa Fe to give a paper. What kind of paper? They said, well, it's a paper on Native Americans. Okay. And that okay sounded like, I'd like to hear more about this. So I said, well, you know, it's about a person, an author, a German author, Karl. You may not have heard about him. No, I haven't. He wrote stories, imagined Native Americans. One of the main characters that he imagined was Winnetou. He said, oh yeah, Winnetou and Old Shatterhand, right? And I said, well, how do you know about Winnetou and Old Shatterhand and don't know about Karl? He said, well, I spent some time in Germany. I assume in the army, he didn't say that, but I spent some time in Germany. And people approached me because I'm Oglala Sioux. And they said, well, you are Indian, you must know Winnetou. And I always told them, I never heard about these people. What are you talking about? So I then asked him, you know, I have the title of my presentation is actually Karl May's Winnetou, Imagining the Noble Savage. And I was not sure if I should use the term noble savage. And he said, well, we don't like that term because people still think we are savages today. But this story actually is what I want to do with the story is to tell you that I'm not being disrespectful to Native Americans by using the term. It is a term that is used in the scholarly discourse because this is what authors did at the time. They imagined something, then created, they constructed individuals that never existed, that have little to do with what Native Americans are, but they are not Native Americans. They constructed and imagined Indians, but there's no such thing as an Indian, right? There's no such thing as a noble savage. But still, this is the term that scholars use to describe what these people did and how they imagined and constructed Native Americans for an audience that actually gobbled it up, that liked it a lot. So, no disrespect here, just doing the scholarly lingo in here. Growing up in the late 50s in Germany, you do read Karl May and you do read Winnetou. That little guy here in that Indian garb, I'm not going to tell you who that is, next to his beloved teacher, Fräulein Pech, was very proud of the costume he got for Christmas actually, and it came with a tomahawk. And that little guy knew very well that that tomahawk was made out of plywood. It was not a real tomahawk, but it felt like a real tomahawk. Whenever that guy had to go into the basement to get something, because his parents forced him to go into that dingy basement where it was dark and musty and there were corners and it was badly lit, he took that tomahawk with him, well knowing that it was a piece of wood, but at the same time knowing that it was a weapon that protected him against the evils that lurked around the next corner. That person, the little guy there, 10 years old, had two images, two ideas, knowledges, facts in his head. One, it is plywood, and the other, it's a real tomahawk. And that works. People in Germany who imagined and read about Winnetou and Indians knew that this was not a real Native American they were reading about. But at the same time, it was the ultimate Native American they were reading about because it was Winnetou. When we played cowboys and Indians, I never wanted to be a cowboy. Hardly anybody wanted to be a cowboy. We all wanted to be Indians because they were more cunning, they could hide better, and the cowboys just had the superior firepower, but that was all. So we wanted to be the cowboys, not the cowboys, but the Indians. We liked it a lot. Who wants to be a cowboy? And we learned all that, how to behave, how to act, how to be an Indian through the books of Karl. He sold about 100 million copies of that book. Every scholar, every historian hopes to sell maybe 1,000, maybe 10,000. Wow. 100 million copies sold of his imagined stories, not only from the Americas, but also from the Near East and the Orient. Winnetou 1 was also made into a movie, but the movie does not really have all that much to do with that first volume of his trilogy, Winnetou. It is a combination of many different books, but that was the first movie that came out in the movie theaters in '64, I think it was. And it was shown in other countries too, in Argentina, Belgium, Netherlands, Romania, Denmark, Czechoslovakia, France, all over the place, and even in the United States. Dubbed here in the United States, or partially dubbed, I heard, I never knew that, with the title Apache Gold. This guy here, I don't know if you recognize him. I'm not going to point. Was a cowboy. He liked superior firepower, I guess. We never met at the time, but I know, being an Indian, I would have won that game. He may have had a gun in his pocket, but I had a bow and arrow, and I know how to hide. This is the first poster of Karl May, Winnetou Part 1 in the movie theaters. And here you can see the famous characters that are actually ingrained in every brain of my generation. This is the ultimate Native American. This is the Indian. This is the noble Indian on your right-hand side. This is Winnetou. Actually, it's an actor, as you know. His name is Pierre Brice. And we always had the impression that Indians have a slight French accent. On his side is Old Shatterhand, his friend, his blood brother. And you could not imagine one without the other. They belonged to each other. They were a pair. They were separate entities, but they were a unity. They only could act and be together, although they were two different persons in the movie. So when I saw the poster for the American version of Winnetou Eins, I was surprised that there's only the white person in front. And I put them next to each other here to let you kind of see the difference in the posters, in the movie posters. Actually, you see that the Let's Barker, that picture is only flipped over. It is the same picture. It's reversed. But Winnetou is in the background. He has the same pose, but he is in the background. He is something, a prop that is in the background. I think if people would have tried to sell the movie using the right-hand poster, they would not have been very successful. Because in my generation's mind, Winnetou and Old Shatterhand were always together. And you could not imagine them as they were pictured or displayed on that poster for the American version of it. And it probably tells you something about the preferences that you have in the United States looking at Western movies, because the cowboys, John Wayne and all these people are much more important for an American audience than they are for a German audience, especially an audience that grew up with reading Karl May. Excuse me. On the right-hand side is Bravo magazine. That's a youth magazine. Someone is smiling here. Who grew up with that? Yes. Very important. And what they had in there is the so-called Starschnitt, a cutout. Every issue had a little piece of Winnetou or other people, and you cut it out, and you had a paper board, you could glue it together, and then you had a life-size image of Winnetou. It turned out that Winnetou was about that tall, which was kind of a letdown. I was mad at that paper at Bravo at the time. But Bravo is a youth magazine that created or helped to create Pierre Brice as Winnetou as the ultimate Native American in the mind of my generation. Winnetou, an Apache Mescalero chief. People down there in Mescalero would probably be very much surprised to hear about Winnetou. And I know that there was a newspaper article a year ago about when, on the 100 years after Karl died in 2012, they had an article, and they had a reporter go down to Mescalero Apache Reservation and ask the chief, he said, "I'm not a chief, I'm a president, what are you talking about?" If he knew about Winnetou, and said, "No, never heard about it, but yeah, well, there are sometimes German Air Force pilots come up here and ask us about Winnetou, you know, these strange people there." But he is the ultimate Indian, the ultimate noble savage for the Germans. He's not a Mescalero Apache because he's clearly a Plains Indian, which the Apaches, the Mescaleros, never were. And even the prize that Bravo gave to actors and singers and so forth was shaped into a little tiny Indian, the Bravo Otto. It's like the Oscar, you know, nomination. The one I brought here is for Madonna, actually, not for Pierre Brice, on that side here. So even that is geared toward the Indian image or the image of the Indian. The fascination of that couple of Old Shatterhand and Winnetou was, I think, very, very enticing for my generation when you grew up 10 years or 12 years or 8 years old. Nobility, friendship, male bonding. You didn't play with the girls, you had good friends and you played with each other and did hide and seek actually by playing Indian and cowboy at the time. And he's a good looking man, I mean, isn't he? Pierre Brice. Winnetou's Indians were shaped in that image of a noble savage, constructed, as the historians say, in the image of a noble savage. And he has all that information that many authors and people at the time had, and all that idea about what Indians and Native Americans were. They were the dying men, a dying race, a vanishing race at the time. And he goes on in this introduction to Winnetou 1 that they should have had a chance to develop socially and intellectually and politically, but they were never granted the time. And there's so much social Darwinism in his writing too, when he says that there's the crucial law that the weaker must yield to the stronger, and this applies also to the Native Americans, to the Indians in the United States. And he deplores that, but he does not see a solution, except for remembering Winnetou. Because Karl always claimed that he actually was Old Shatterhand, that he actually traveled in the United States, that Winnetou actually existed and lived and actually was a noble person. None of this is actually true. Karl, for the first time, went to the United States in 1908 when he was an old man. The idea of a free hunter, formerly proud, brave, faithful to his friends, is turned by the Yankees, by the white man, by the English in the United States into a sly, suspicious, and dishonest creature. And this is what the whites made out of the Native Americans. He now is reduced, the Indian, to begging and stealing, when before he was strong enough to fight the grizzly bear with his bare hands, a strong person. This is the image that is being created. And my claims that Winnetou is a true representative of his race,
as he perishes, he says, he also, as the race perishes, he also perished at the time. A very sad story, but he wants to remember it. And Winnetou. A little bit of theory. When people imagine things like Karl May did, that is actually a very complex construct of something that is perceived but not real, something that people assume is there, and it is based on very often little factual information. And this is repeated again and again. It's collectively held assumptions about a people or a race. It is not one person, but you have to spread that out. It is being spread out by literature, by books, by pictures, by paintings, and by movies. This lends itself to stereotyping peoples. But stereotypes are not important and not per se very bad, because we seem to need stereotypes to actually put things that we see for the first time into a certain framework, so that we can understand better what they are. If we are encountered with something that we have never seen before, we automatically apply a stereotype to make us understand what this is. We apply previous knowledge to something that we see for the first time. And here stereotypes have a useful function, but they can also become very negative when the imagination becomes something into a racially construct, or something that constructs, in this case, a noble savage that cannot be saved from his doomed vanishing. Images, pictures, and performances have to fit into this established iconography. If they do not fit into this, we say that this cannot be true. If you see a picture of a Native American that does not fit into the picture that we have in our heads of Winnetou and the Plains Indians, we assume that this is not a real Indian anymore. And this happens very often, and this happened in the 19th century and in the 20th century, as I will show you using a few examples. So these images strengthen and validate what we know, or seem to know, or hope to know, or what we have constructed about about Native Americans. It has not much to do with the truth. It has not much to do with real Native Americans. It is something that we assume exists, and this is what Karl May is doing. Karl May is not the first person who imagines Indians. James Fenimore Cooper is someone who does that in the United States, and he's widely read in Germany before Karl May. The Leather Stocking Tales, for example, are being published in 1826, and they are translated almost automatically into German as Der letzte Mohikaner. I brought you two examples here of book cover and the first title page here. And you have, as Winnetou does, in Fenimore Cooper's also the creation, the construction of a noble savage. Chingachgook and Unctas are the two people who are noble Indians who fight against bad Indians. May has that too. He has good Indians, which are the Apaches, and he has bad Indians, another tribe. So the idea that May developed was not very new, and German readers who read May for the first time at the end of the 19th century very often had read before books by Fenimore Cooper, because they were interested in the far west, into exotic and other and strange countries. And this all is based on a background noise, you could say, of a mythology of the West, of a golden age. We assume that there was once upon a time a golden age where everything was peaceful, and the noble savage falls into that pattern as being part of that golden age in the past, Greek and Roman mythology. And a lot of thinkers, even Thomas Jefferson, thought in this way and had this image in his head when he thought about Native Americans. Thomas Jefferson, excuse me, third president. I need a little bit of water. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, also had this idea, this construct of Native Americans as a noble but doomed race. We find that in his writing. He was fascinated by original and uncorrupted, quote-unquote, Native American cultures and languages, and he collected many Native American artifacts in his house in Monticello. But he also strove to civilize Native Americans because he thought that you had to save the person by doing away with a culture, with that part of the Indians that is doomed. There's this saying at the time, you have to kill the Indian to save the man. And you have a lot of different approaches to save Native Americans from that doom by civilizing them very forcefully sometimes, and a lot of hardship went on at that time. Jefferson is a little bit shaky about that. He seems to like Native Americans, American culture, but then again he believes that only converting Native Americans into yeoman farmers is the way out and the way to survival. Or if they don't do that, they have to be removed, can be removed to the west across the Mississippi. Louisiana Purchase was 1803, so there was lots of free quote-unquote land still to have. If they didn't want to become civilized, they could move someplace else. He actually offers to Native Americans a hand, and he says in one address to actually Mohawk Indians in Delaware in 1808, in December, that we all shall be Americans. You will mix with us in marriage even. Your blood will run in our veins and will spread with us over this great island, over this great continent at the time. So the idea of a big empire was still there. And the idea of incorporating Native Americans into the American society was still there. But again, it was the idea, the construct of a noble race, a noble savage that was dearly held in Jefferson's mind, and ideas about Native Americans at the time. And you can also find that in the iconography of America at the time. Continents are displayed in female bodies. Every continent is a female in a female shape. And America was always displayed as a naked woman, as a woman still in the golden age, uncivilized, didn't need clothing because it was paradise. They lived in paradise here in America. That is the idea. Never mind that barbecue in the back where they roast a human leg. That is also part of the iconography. But here, Amerigo Vespucci is awakening America to be conquered and saved at the same time. The image of paradise, of nobility, is always there as a background noise when these people think about Native Americans. German fascination with Native Americans seems to be peculiar, but there's many, many European nations that we have a fascination with Native Americans and the Indians and the noble savage at that time. I mentioned the many dubbed versions of Winnetou 1, the first movie that came out. But for Germans, it seems to be a particular interest. There are so many hobbyists still now that play Indian all the time, that remake Indian artifacts, that try to behave like Indian. I just looked at the website an hour or 2 hours ago where the Mescalero Apache Tribe Verein of Düsseldorf is telling you how the Apache Indian behaves in a teepee. And this is what they do, how they enter, how they do this and how they do that. I don't know where they get these ideas, but it is a strive for authenticity they have that has not much to do with real life of Native Americans today, and it has not much to do with Native American life in the 19th century at the time. And there's many scholars who kind of contemplate why there is so much more fascination in Germany with Native Americans, with Indians and the noble savage. And there are a lot of different explanations. And one is that Germany has lacked colonies for so long. And because Germany had no colonies before 1884, all the other nations had colonies. French and British had colonies. So the Germans had to imagine being colonizers and being different colonizers, because they knew that the French and English were not treating their colonial races very nicely. The Germans would do it much better in their imagination. But they actually didn't. I mean, in the German Southwest in Africa, the Herero uprising, that was a bloody massacre they did there. But the imagination of doing it better than the others, than the arch enemies Germany's had in the 19th century and part of 20th century, was there. Bismarck used this and actually allowed Germany to have that, some colonies. But Germany was for a long time untainted by a large-scale first-hand experience. This is what scholars say. The stories and imaginations fill a void that is not there. The place at the sun that Germans didn't have was in their heads and in their imaginations. At the same time, there are explanations that this has much to do with cultural pessimism. If you imagine someone who lives in a golden age and is noble and is savage, this has to do with being or not coming to grips with modernity and a democratic society, and with having to negotiate differences all the time in a very complex industrializing society. So there's many different explanations, not one that is really clear-cut, but I think the basic idea comes across when I delineate what people think about this. And I think part of it, what I just said, holds true for at least part of an explanation. Oh, that was too fast. I'm sorry. Actually, I'm not going back. I wanted to say that the name Emanuel Gottlieb Leutze wouldn't ring a bell to most of you, but this picture probably does. It's Washington crossing the Delaware. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and a copy is in the White House. In Germany, Leutze is much better known for his paintings on the right-hand side. Der letzte Mohikaner, for his Indian paintings, because that is what he did while he was in Düsseldorf. Leutze was born in Germany. He's a German. His name actually says that, I think, pretty much. In Schwäbisch Gmünd, and he immigrated to the United States, but he came back, as many American painters did at the time, to Düsseldorf, where they had a very famous art academy, painting academy. And he painted The Last Mohican there while he was there. Another painter, Karl Ferdinand Wiemer, also immigrated to the United States, also came back to Düsseldorf, and is also known in Germany for his paintings of Native Americans that actually display this noble savage, as Karl May did later in his volumes on Winnetou. And both of these painters are well known in Germany and partially also in the United States for their paintings at the time. But as I said, the image that you have, and these images by Wiemer and Leutze fit into the expectation of what an Indian had to look like. Other Indians had to fit that expectations. But when Germans developed the idea that it might be a good idea to actually bring Native Americans to Germany to kind of tour and be seen by people, the first group were the Bella Coola from British Columbia, First Nation, Canadian First Nation. And this is how they looked like. This is not the image of a Native American. This is not what people would accept as being Native Americans at the time. In 1885, the Bella Coola toured Germany, were invited to go to Germany. They displayed, they lived in Hagenbeck's Tierpark, Hagenbeck's Zoo, as part of what they call the Völkerschauen, the people shows. That was something that was going on beginning in 1870, where zoos invited people to come to them and establish a village to show the Germans how Africans lived, or Eskimos, Inuit lived, or Americans lived, First Nations lived, and not Americans, I'm sorry, First Nations lived and Native Americans lived. And that was something that we think is cruel today, but it was going on widespread in many, many places, not only in Germany. And Hagenbeek displayed the Bella Kula. They toured 22 German cities, and they displayed their dances and their masks and their mythology to the audiences. Actually, the reactions were very different in the public from those of anthropologists at the time. The anthropologist Franz Boas, for example, who became famous for his anthropology and ethnology studies later in the United States after he had emigrated, was enchanted, and he liked that very much. He even believed that seeing these people in a zoo was something that was important for getting a better knowledge of how these people lived. But the public didn't like them at all, because they weren't real Indians. They didn't look like the last Mohican. They didn't look like Plains Indian. They looked like this when they performed. And this is not Winnetou. It is not Chingachgook. It's not Unctus. It is something very different. It is fascinating, this culture, but the Germans didn't like it at all. So this was the only tour that the Bella Kula actually did. Franz Boas developed his whole theory on them. He did a lot of studies on other First Nation that was established right next to the Bella Kula in British Columbia. So it was very important to have these people in Germany, but not for correcting the complex idea about what Indians actually were supposed to do. As I said, human zoos existed at the time. Hagenbeek was only one of them. Others did that too in the context of Völkerschauen. It was part of making money. It was part of commercialism. You could attract lots and lots of people. You had to find people actually to be Native Americans, to be Indians in these zoos. And agents of Hagenbeek's Tierpark traveled to the United States and tried to hire Native Americans to be displayed in these zoos. And they also came to the Pine Ridge Reservation at the time, trying to find Sioux Indians, members of the Sioux tribe, to come to Hagenbeek. They couldn't find very many who actually looked like the Indians they imagined that Indians had to look like. But one of them was Edward Nupala. He was hired in 1910, and you see him in the picture up on the left-hand side. He was named after that Chief Edward Tutu. His name was Nupala, which has a similar meaning in his native language, but he was named chief. But actually he was a reservation police person. He was never a chief. And the headgear that he has on display here, which is a picture from Hagenbeek that you see, well, he got that in Hamburg, in Germany, because they didn't have it at his reservation. And this is exactly how Germans thought that Sioux Indian chiefs had to look like. It was made by German people in Hamburg and was part of his outfit that he received there. After being in Hagenbeek, he toured with a circus, Sarasani, posters here on the left-hand side, with a Sioux show, a big show that attracted lots and lots of people. And when these Sarasani Indians, quote-unquote, came to Dresden, they did not visit Clara May, the then widow in 1913 of Karl May. And the Radebeul Tageblatt complained about that very loudly, because May was such a friend of the Indians, and they should have come to see his widow. They probably never heard about Karl May and never knew that there was Clara May waiting for them to pay them a visit. Edward Nupala died in 1914 in Essen while touring with Sarasani, and only then did the public find out that he was a devout Catholic. which destroyed a little bit of that picture. And then they found out that his two sons, who were also touring with him, were also Catholic and catechists. They were missionaries within the Indian tribes. And that destroyed that picture a little bit. And then finally, Chief Edward Tutu decided, or had decided, when he was ill and he knew that he would probably die and not make it back to the United States, that he wanted to be buried in Dresden and not at the Pine Ridge Reservation. That was an additional shock to the German public. His gravestone is still there. You can, it's hard to read. Sioux-Häuptling Edward Tutu, Sioux Chief Edward Tutu. And this gravestone was not put on his grave in 1914, but was put there in 1926 by the Circus Zarazani, who then started a new Sioux show. Sioux show, in their advertising, they actually referred to Sheriff Tutu, to Chief Tutu, and used this tombstone as a display. We have always had the real Indian chiefs in our show, and one was such a devout friend of Circus Zarazani that he actually wanted to be buried in Dresden and not go back to his home country. So it's advertisement, what you see here, actually. It is not circuses only, it's not only Völkerschauen in the human zoos, but it was also the Wild West shows that introduced real, quote-unquote, Native Americans, real Indians to Germany at the time. And you had a lot of different Wild West shows touring in Germany. William Frank Doc Carver, Buffalo Bill Coley, Pawnee Bill, who actually, his actual name was Gordon William Liddy, etc., were touring Germany and other parts of Europe at the time. It was a big market. They made quite a bit of money. It was a huge undertaking. Hundreds of people had to be shipped from the United States. Props made up, gears had to be fabricated, had to be made in Germany, and they had to be outfitted. They had to be choreographed for what they did at the time. So sometimes you had a situation when two of these shows, not having talked to each other before, ended up in the same city at the same time. So in 1890, Doc Carver and Bill Cody ended up in Hamburg. And Doc Carver was a little bit faster than Bill Cody and got all the electricity that Hamburg could offer at the time. And Bill Cody was in the dark. Cody was the most successful of all these West shows, Wild West shows. He had toured Europe from 1883 to 1913. Very successful all over Europe, even in Italy. An estimated 10 million visitors saw these displays of Indians in these Wild West shows. And it was Indians, Native Americans that were actually playing Indians. Because often you had Native Americans entering the shows because it was good money. It was getting away from the reservations, being able to travel to foreign countries. But you had to be a Sioux Indian, even if you came from upstate New York and couldn't ride a horse. You had to learn that, and they actually taught these people to ride horses to appear in these shows. So it was Native Americans playing Indians and serving the images that people had in their minds about what an Indian was supposed to look like. This is a self-serving and referencing system that makes the image of Indians stronger and stronger at the same time. Here's another picture of Bill Cody and some of his actors, some of the Native Americans that played in the shows. And they even made it to Venice and were put in a gondola. This is a real picture. They had only black and white at the time, but they colored it in later on. These Native Americans playing Indians had a contract that said they had to behave and be Indians also outside of the shows. They had to go about the city with their headgears on and what they had received from the Wild West show people who provided them with clothing and so forth. So they always were advertisements that walked through the cities at the time. In the Berliner Tageblatt, July 22nd, 1890, there was an ad actually telling the people what they had to expect. Buffalo Bill claimed that this was real people he had, that were actually performing in his shows. Only real, no artificial props. It is no exaggeration. It is all real that is shown there. Everything is right. It is as it happened in the past, in the Wild West. That is past. That doesn't exist anymore. They are all from the American West. They are all real. Nothing is made up. It is a picture from the past. Warriors and riders of the Wild West. That is what he's claiming. That is what he is showing. So there is reality and imagination mingling here into something that you can hardly take apart anymore. Myth and history play into each other, and you cannot really see anymore what is reality, what is made up, what is actually playing, what is not. It is an assumed authenticity. People behave so that people think this is authentic, but it actually is a fairy tale that people see, what people see at the time. This is making it more authentic by playing it because it actually plays to the imagination that people have. There's one story of one Onanganda Native American from upstate New York who was hired for one of these shows, and he came back to his reservation with a headgear, a Sioux headgear, and that was a souvenir. And he displayed this and said, "See what I have, this is wonderful. This is what I have from Germany, from Hamburg actually. This is what they do." So, you know, where's reality here anymore? Where is Native American, where's playing Indian, what is the Indian? It's very confusing, but it's not at the same time, because the Germans at the time believed this is Indians, this is the Indians, this is the noble savage we see here at the time. This is actually real. Karl May, I finally come to Karl May, didn't like Buffalo Bill at all. He hated these shows. I have a little clip here, a little quote from him, where he says, well, he's only showing red robbers, red thieves, gangsters, murderers, playing their major role. And the actors were Indians. He actually is very mad at the Native Americans playing Indians. He sees what these people are doing. He is smart enough to actually detect that this is Native Americans playing Indians. And what he does at the very end in this quote is very revealing. I did my very best to do away with this bloodthirstiness and to idealize the red man in my Winnetou. So what he's doing is he's doing actually exactly the same, but the opposite of what Bill Cody is doing. It's not the bloodthirsty Indian that does the big show, you know, where you shoot and murder. It is the noble savage that he is imagining and creating, and he knows that. He's not doing that without knowing what he is doing. We do not know if Karl May ever met Bill Cody. Most likely he never did. There's no evidence that he did. There's only one story by Clara May 6 years after Karl May had died, and that is revealing too. Because he said, well, Karl May went to one of these Bill Cody shows, and Karl May spoke at length in their native language to the Indians. The Indians' native language, yes. I did not understand anything. Cody must have known what had been said because he slapped May on the back and said in English, "You're an idealist, my friend. Only the right of the strongest and smartest counts." Social Darwinism again. Well, Karl May didn't speak any Native American language, and not the Indian language, which he tells us in his stories existed, and he didn't speak any English. So Clara May is doing her very best here to make her husband, famous husband, deceased husband, into the big hero that he always assumed that he was. And I think these two pictures which I brought here are very revealing too. On the right-hand side you see Buffalo Bill Cody dressed up, and on the left-hand side is Karl May. And the similarities are striking, aren't they? The picture of Buffalo Bill was made in 1890. Karl May is doing his picture in 1896. So he's actually imitating Bill Cody. But Bill Cody is imagining himself, because when you look at him, no real trapper would go out like that. Look at that belt buckle. I mean, you can't bend over, you cut yourself in half. So what May is doing, he's imagining a hero, while Bill Cody is doing the same, and then copying that imagination. So where's reality and authenticity here? Probably nowhere, and still it is there, and it's still there in the image of what these people are. I like that very much. I think it's not the silver, is it the silver Büchse?
Yep.
I think it is the silver gun that you can see on display here, which is Winnetou's famous gun, made in Dresden. The image that Karl May wanted to create of the noble savage, of the good Indian, as opposite to the bad Indian, the red thieves and murderers that Cody had in his show, actually took some time. And there is an evolution that you can see when you look at Old Fire, and which is the first time that Winnetou actually appears in May's writings. At that time, Winnetou is described as brutish. He has a rusty gun, not the silver gun. He scalps his enemy without hesitation. He smokes. Winnetou, a smoker, my God. And he smokes the Indian way, as May tells us, by inhaling and blowing out the smoke through his nose. That's how Indians smoke. And then he eats the cigarette butts. That's what Indians do too. This is not really the noble savage that we saw in the movies and we read in the books that we have seen. That developed into a more rarefied and refined Native American at the same time. And you can actually detect the impact that May's other writings and readings have on that development, on that evolution into the noble savage. He actually adopted Gabriel Ferry's Der Waldläufer, an adventure with the Apaches for younger readers. And you have a lot of things there that make the main, or not the main character, but one of the important characters of that story, the Comanche Yambula, into a noble savage. And you can actually see that May is taking not the script, not the text out, but ideas from what he's reading. He took a lot of material from encyclopedias, but he never really copied from other writers. He's not a plagiarist in that sense that he copied widespread. The influence of Old Shatterhand on Winnetou becomes stronger when we go forward in May's writing. The German engineer, which Old Shatterhand is having influence on that Native American to create him into an even nobler savage. Upon the influence of Old Shatterhand, for example, Winnetou gives up revenge, which is very important. And on his deathbed, he even calls himself a Christian going away. So there is an interplay between Old Shatterhand as we move along in the stories that May developed, where Winnetou is becoming more and more noble. As I said, May read a lot of literature, Charles Sealsfield, Gabriel Ferry, Gustave Le Mans, Fenimore Cooper, Friedrich Gerstecker, all that was in his huge library that he had, but he copied parts of encyclopedias. That's what he actually did, in his early writings at least. Until 1899, he maintained that Winnetou was a real person and had really lived, and that he had known Winnetou, and that he had been really Old Shatterhand, that actually Old Shatterhand is him, that he had traveled and had experienced all these adventures. There's a big dispute about this, and May actually has to admit that he had never been to the United States, that Winnetou never lived. And then he actually says that, well, he always wanted to create Winnetou into an image as a symbol for the real red man as such as the noble savage. In 1897, I even planned to write a Winnetou opera. I'm not sure if we should be glad that that didn't succeed. I have not seen any similar stuff from him. It was until 1908 that I traveled into the United States. He was frail at the time, and he was already an old and a sick person. He was ill at the time. And he traveled in New York up to Niagara Falls, and he traveled to some of the reservations, but he didn't really get along with Native Americans. He didn't like what he saw at the time. But this actually is the only time that I had been in the United States, and that is the only time, except for encounters possibly in Wild West shows in Dresden, that he actually had actually seen Native Americans. Here are a few covers from the early imprints of Winnetou, Part 1. And it is also fascinating, and I'm not sure if there is any study, but I think it might be worthwhile to look at that, how even in the book covers, the idea of Winnetou develops. You can see there's a small person standing there. This is Winnetou waiting for Old Shatterhand at that tree. And then you have pictures like that. This is supposed to display what Winnetou is all about. Or even this. And this is really an image of a noble savage that is connected to an eternal light, to the golden age, to paradise. And it is a figure that is male and female at the same time, too. And I found that very interesting. Someone else will have to do that, not me. The question is who in this novel? Who is Winnetou? Who is Old Shatterhand? Winnetou is a Native American that doesn't exist, a Mescalero Apache that is a Plains Indian, and Old Shatterhand is a German engineer that goes to the American West and becomes not an Indian, but a teacher of Winnetou. He becomes more like Winnetou, but they are still separate people at the time. The German engineer seems to be, in this novel, the better white man when it comes to relations with Native Americans. And that also plays into that aspect of blood brotherhood. When I was 10 years old, and I think it's true for Thomas too, I mean, it was so brave. You had to cut your wrist, blood, and oh man, that hurt. You wouldn't want to do that at all. And they did it, and then they pressed their hands together to, you know, kind of bind themselves through the blood to have a blood brotherhood. Scholars say that this is a transnational cultural transfer and so forth through communication while accepting difference, because they become the same. They are mingling their blood, not in marriage, but by exchanging the blood. They are becoming the same but at the same time staying individuals and the same person. They are fulfilling their destiny, because Winnetou at the end dies. He is part of the vanishing race. He is the last, like the last Mohican. He has to die to fulfill his destiny. And at the same time, Germany, Old Shatterhand, is the benevolent colonial power that I actually envisioned at the time. And I have to find that one quote I wanted to show you here. In one of the very last writings of Karl in a book, Ardistan and Jindistan, which doesn't play in the West, there's a quote here which I find very revealing. It says here, "The present-day Yankee will disappear, so that a new man will form in his place, whose soul is Germanic Indian." This is the idea that is all behind this. It is a unification of German traits as the benevolent, better colonizer and the noble savage that lives in a golden age, that goes together into a new century, millennium, maybe. Oops, what happened? Oh no, you don't. The computer wants to start again. I won't admit that. This doesn't stop after Karl dies, as we know, who read Karl, who read his stories and who saw his pictures. The fascination with modernity in the 20s after Germany lost the First World War also plays into the image of Native Americans and the Indians. On the right-hand side is a drawing by George Gross, a famous 1920s painter. And he says, friend Chingachgook, für Freund Chingachgook. He liked Indians, he liked the United States, he liked America so much that he changed his first name from Georg into George, and that he converted his studio into a tipi, and that he invited his fellow friends, artists in to show them how Americans lived and how they act by showing them how to smoke a pipe, how to box, and how to live in a teepee. Perceptions of America in the Indian change, but the basic stays the same at the time. You can see that in many artists' writings, you can that in paintings, and you can actually see that in Macke's painting here, Indiana, where you can see the Indian who is part of the background, part of the paradise, part of the jungle, while the white person looks in and he looks out. So that image is still there. It even is part of the German army idea about what the United States stands for. After the First World War, Germany's army was reduced to 100,000 men. And for the Germans, it was important, for the German army, it was important to find information about how to defend themselves, how to modernize the army. So they sent missions to the United States. And one of these missions went to Fort Bliss, I think it was, and attended a dinner party. Hauptmann Friedrich Nagel, Captain Friedrich Nagel, reported back to the headquarters of the German army that quite obviously the United States Army still praised the bravery of the American Indians because they fought so valiantly as noble people, as noble fighters, by, after the dinner, standing up, raising their glasses and saying, hook, 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 which is, in Mai's language, what Indians said to each other at the end of sentences when they wanted to finish something, exclaim something, make an exclamation. It comes from, Fenimore Cooper has that, how, somehow that translated into language. But why does the United States Army praise the bravery of Indians by saying hook, 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 hook? That only exists in Mai's literature. You have to think about a German officer going there who had read Cooper and Mai, and he hears people saying hook, and he tries to find out what they had said because that sound is not familiar, although he speaks English. They didn't say hook. They tried to praise him, to honor him by saying hoch, hoch, hoch. And when someone who cannot do that sound, as Germans or Swiss German or whoever can do that, it comes out like hook, hook, hook. And because he couldn't understand that, he thought they praised the Native Americans, the Indians, Winnetou, that he thought was such a brave soldier, and he'd seen the United States Army as brave people. So you have that image there all the time. I'm not sure if that actually translated into the ordering of 3,000 copies of Mai's book in 1944 during the Second World War as handbooks. Were supposed to be used as handbooks for guerrilla warfare, because the commanders had to read Karl May's books to find out how the Indians fought, so that they can fight the approaching Russian Red Army and the approaching Americans. Old imaginations never die, they just fade away. I stole this from Douglas MacArthur. For some time, somehow, a little bit, playing Indian is very big in Germany. The images and realities in West and East Germany are very different. You have Indianisten in the GDR, which actually had a political connotation partially. The Stasi, which is the internal security agency in the German Democratic Republic, actually had their agents into these Indian hobbyists because they thought they did something very wrong there. We had Pierre Brice, the East Germans had Gojko Mitic, a Yugoslavian, who actually played similar stories. Mine was banned because supposedly, and we are not sure about that, Adolf Hitler liked Karl May, so they couldn't print his books in East Germany at the time. But Gojko Mitic did socialist Indian stories. It was the same kind of construction. It had hardly anything to do with Native American life at the time or in the 19th century. It was geared towards socialism and letting people know that Indians are the better socialists and they all should become better socialists. We had a very famous movie a few years ago, The Shoot Is Money, to a spoof on the Winnetou movies. And it actually is a very good movie because it deconstructs the construction of the Indian by playing with that. When Winnetou and Old Shatterhand in that movie cut their wrists to, mingle their bloods, they say, "Ouch! Are you crazy? This hurts!" Winnetou would never have said that, by Karl May. It sticks so much in your brain that even someone who was taught in the United States, who had met Native Americans in his life, who had spent quite a number of years in the United States, who teaches North American history at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum, was surprised when he, with Thomas 20 years ago, my God, 20 years ago, visited Window Rock, sitting in a restaurant, being served by a Navajo waitress, no problem, when a council member came in. And the Navajo council member, braids, in a three-piece suit. That doesn't work. You cannot have an Indian in a three-piece suit. Okay, it was a Navajo, I know now. But it's still there in my brain, trying to find its way into that image of the Native American, Indian, noble savage that I got from Karl May. I'm still working on it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that was over an hour. Very patient. Yes? The question was, for those who couldn't understand the question, how could Karl May get these stories, never having been in the United States, never having met Native Americans? He had a very vivid imagination, quite obviously. He read a number of books of people who actually had been in the United States, who had actually met Native Americans, who had been in South America or in other parts of this continent. And he read those books, but he didn't copy out of them, he didn't plagiarize, but he used this idea and made that into his own image of the noble savage, of the Indian, which is not a Native American at the time. And he used encyclopedias to get factual information, and he's pretty good at that. Yes?
I wanted to ask you about the film.
Yep.
Because after all this time, and that was filmed in the 60s,
Yeah.
how they could still not understand the concept of regalia and how people dress, because they're talking about mescaleros with, Plains Indian clothing. But then they also had the people who were dressed more like Puebloans, and with the hairdo and
Right.
And so you had all this, and so I'm thinking, well, who did their research for this film?
No one. No one.
But this is 1960, it's not 1910. I mean, so it's like, how does it still happen?
I don't think that anyone actually did research for that, who was a historian or someone who actually was an anthropologist or ethnographer or whatever. They tried to make a commercial success they put people, characters in there that you do not even find in Karl May's volumes. There is, for example, a British person, Lord Howe. He isn't in that, in Karl May's writings. It was a pretty famous British person living in Germany who was a musician and did radio shows. And he is the funny character. He's the British who has his umbrella in the prairies. It was not an attempt of actually trying to depict Native Americans as they were or as they are. It was an attempt to make money by using Karl May's stories as a quarry. It's not even a good rendition of Karl May's Winnetou.
So how do the people today in Germany who are doing all these reenactments, you know, like in the U.S. we have military reenactments and historic things, where do they get their ideas or their historical, I mean, what do they look like today? Because are they still a mishmash of all this kind of
I think they are trying to be more authentic. They are getting better information. They are widely read. Some of these people are traveling to the United States, actually having contacts with many American First Nations or Native Americans. But what they try to recreate is something that is supposedly authentic by sewing themselves clothing that look alike but are not real. It is always the old imagination of the good Indian in there, and as we know, not all white people are good people, and not all Native Americans are good people. So there's always this idea in there that still the Native Americans are noble savages, and the savage is a little bit smaller now, but it's still there. And most of these people do not think much about what they do. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun dressing up. It's an escape from reality. It's going back where you have supposedly strict rules how to behave. As I mentioned before, when you look at the website, you find this is how you enter a tipi. This is how you behave in a tipi. I don't know if that is true, but does it make much sense? Possibly not. Does it make much sense for understanding Native Americans today? Not much. It's reenactment by people who think that they know something about Native Americans. Yes, sir.
Just a couple of things. One is this interesting phenomenon of Native peoples being displayed in an animal park together with the animals. And what could possibly be the rationale for that? Well, one thing is that in various evolutionary theories, including in Hegel, the savage is close to the animal. And then you have the evolution from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized.
Yeah.
And what they share is what the animal and the savage share is that they really had no history. They lived a life of pure repetition, as in ritual. Therefore, they were closer to instinct.
Yeah.
Presumably, the animal lived purely by instinct. And I think that's one of the bases of this sort of approximation of the savage to the animal. A second thing on the question of why would people in Germany be fascinated by the Indian or the Native American? Well, I think one thing that may be at play as well, especially after 1945, is identification with the victim, not with the aggressor. And the Indian was, in general, in a kind of victim position, historically and as perceived. And that might be one of the things going on as well.
That could be. That is actually one of the theories that one of my colleagues is actually has developed, that this has something to do with victimization, and not only after 45, but even before that. So it's an emphasis with the victim in Germany feeling themselves, many Germans feeling themselves being victims of the major and superior powers. I'm not sure about that. I would probably more agree that it has to do with anti-modernism and problems with adjusting to a very complex society, that even that in your free time often you go back reverting to something that seems to be secure and authentic. To the first question,
The savage and the animal.
savage and Indian. I don't think that Hagenbeck actually made that connection. Hagenbeck wanted to introduce his zoo, and he used the Völker shows, who had been successful in other places, not even in zoos, to promote his zoo in Hamburg. So he had this attraction in that. And although we find that very cruel today, having people being displayed next to animals in a zoo and making that connection between the savage and the animal. The public didn't take it as such. They actually invited people out. They tried to communicate with these people. They were very interested in their lives. But it is a very strange idea that you stand in front of a railing and that behind that you see people supposedly living their real lives, which is an act. It is an enactment of something. But at that time, it was a means of first making money. These people weren't forced to come there. They were agents going out to different countries, asking people, would you like to, display, come your little village into our zoo, into our environment. You can make money, see different countries. And it was a means of making money on both sides at the times. But the public didn't see these people as close to animals. Maybe as people who weren't as quote-unquote civilized, but they were perceiving them mostly as the other, something that they were not, which helped in their own identification. If you always need an other to be sure on yourself and what yourself are. And I think that is the more important thing here. Yes?
I'm sure you're familiar with the great American Indian artist, Fritz Shoulder. And what do you associate his tremendous success in selling his work in Germany when he was greatly, he was really well received. And is it because he was American Indian or because Fritz Shoulder is also German?
I think it made it easier for him to sell his work in Germany because he was part German, but also it falls into this line of being enticed, being enchanted by everything that is Indian, and there was a big market for that, a big interest in that.
By the way, one comment. You mentioned that as a child, when you had corn pie, you knew that the characters weren't real, but it's still, you were excited. My experience was different. As a teenager, I really thought that these characters were based on real persons. I didn't have the feeling that they were made up.
I don't recall why I knew that Winnetou had not existed. I didn't know much about that. I liked the stories, I liked Winnetou, I liked the two being together, this band of young men working together, but I may have heard it. Somewhere I knew it, as I knew my tomahawk wasn't real. But that didn't make a difference. As the tomahawk didn't, as knowing that it was plywood, didn't make a difference when I had to go into the basement. It was equally real for me, while knowing that it was a character that existed in literature. Yes?
I'm curious as to whether the Westerns that were popular in the United States went across to Germany, and even like the Lone Ranger and Tonto, things like that, were they, did they become part of the popular culture there, and how were they received?
They were shown, they were received very well, but that was a different kind of idea and genre. I must admit, I'm not even sure how you actually connect these two in your minds, because on the one hand you have Winnetou, the noble person, and then you have John Wayne, who is kind of saving the white settlers from the bad Indians all the time. But it was possible because in mind it was not that all Indians are good Indians. There were also bad Indians, so you could actually connect these two. But these movies were shown, and they're very famous, yeah.
Do young people still read Karl?
Amazingly, yes. I asked my students before coming here in one of my classes, do you still know Karl May? And about half of the class raised their hands and said, yeah, we've read Karl May. But I'm not sure if the Shooters Money to the spoof on Winnetou actually helped getting people back to reading Karl May. They haven't read all of Karl May's works as you have, but you know, they started reading it and probably see movies which you can download on YouTube and the internet all the time. They do that. So there's still people reading Karl May, yeah. Yes.
Don't you think that part of it was because European culture was, you know, we're talking over 1,000 years, you know, of civilization and history and all that. And so here you have this kind of almost paradise lost, is what you were saying earlier when you were speaking. So there's this image, this aura of not only uniqueness, but at that time when things were perfect. And so where you have this, where maybe you're living in a town where, you know, the buildings are hundreds of years old and the communities and all that sort of thing. So there's just kind of this fantasy land,
Yeah.
almost like we would do with going to space, you know, having Star Trek, spacey kinds of things. But at the same time that was going on in Germany, Americans are the same way. I mean, my brothers, when they were little boys, they had Indian stuff and tomahawks and Davy Crockett hats and all the stuff, the fantasy things. But they knew it was fantasy, but yet Davy Crockett was a real person. You know, so children's books would talk about Davy Crockett. So they got those raccoon hats with the tails on them for Christmas. That's a big deal, you know. So that's maybe part of human nature as well. It's just like in our country, we have these reenactments of the Civil War. I mean, right down to the buttons and the very kind of wool that the coats were made of. And, you know, so it just may be human nature, too, to want to have kind of that adventure.
Yes, I agree, but then again, why did Germans go back into their own culture and their own history and reenact what they...
Because it was too old. What I'm saying is it's so much older, and the prehistory would have been so far removed from them, where in our country, it's much more current. I mean, Americans, you know, just we're talking about Harvey House, like we have our, you know, display here, with the trains. I mean, it just came, we came out west with the trains, and so before that half of our continent, or portion of it, wasn't even investigated. So there was just this whole adventure again of going out and learning about the Southwest. So I don't know, it's kind of an interesting, I mean, it's just, our nation is so much newer. And whether it's the natives or whether it's the people who came and colonized, it's a very short period of time when you look at European history or Middle Eastern history. So they were left alone for a lot longer time. I mean, you know, we talk about 1,000 years. Now, here, 1,000 years ago, there were people living very much the way that they lived maybe 200 years ago.
But then again, the United States is much older than Germany is.
Yeah.
The continent.
1871 to 1776.
But we're talking about, you know, European.
Yeah, where can you connect into your past to reenact? There's reenactment of the Roman wars against the Germanic tribes. People do that too in Germany. But Indianerspiel has hide and seek. It has so much elements that young people, especially.
But the Romans were still much more civilized than what we just had here. You know, what we would call civilized a couple hundred years ago.
That was similar.
Yeah, I have a similar story, a few experience in Winnetou. I grew up in Germany in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so I read Winnetou and some movies. And 10 years ago, a friend from Germany, Charlie, came and visited me. And I said, well, we'll go to see the real Indians. We'll go to Acoma Sky City. So we go up to Acoma Sky City. And Charlie's image was destroyed. He said, windows, he said, pickup trucks, and the didn't drive the was a refrigerator, and he was just, he just
I think the gentleman in the back was first.
So what she said, you mentioned that the noble savage, a lot of European countries like this, the Germans perhaps more than all, and you use the colonial maybe a reason, but could there be any tie into this, mention the Roman thing? The Germans, at least part of the Germans, were the only part of Western Europe that the Romans didn't conquer, so that you might have some German, I don't know if you have this in Germany, but history, we resisted the, we were the savages, we held out against the Romans and stuff, just like the Indians. I mean, is there any, just a specious connection I'm thinking of here? Why it might have resonated more with Germans, the noble savage, because they had this, they resisted the Romans, they couldn't get past the Rhine.
Well, a large part of Germany, or what is Germany now, was conquered by the Romans. And you could also, I mean, the French have their story about Obelix and Asterix. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where you have that little village that has resisted the Romans. We have that. And in Great Britain, the Romans invaded, but they didn't come all the way up north. So we have that in many European countries, I think. Yes?
I'm wondering how you would characterize or describe Karl May's transformation in his own self-understanding of what role he was playing kind of as a literary figure or in culture, his own culture, society, more widely. It seemed like maybe we could understand him as an opportunist and as somebody who's shifting, transforming, constantly struck a really lucrative cultural chord, but also the quote you showed made it seem more like he had some sort of, he saw himself as an advocate or as somebody who was helping to change perception, his perception about American Indian.
Yeah, I think both. He was going into a market that was very lucrative. He had a publisher that was very good and made him rewrite stories, like Old Firehand, the volume I mentioned, where he has this still crude image of Winnetou, gets transformed into Winnetou 2, and he changes the story in there. But he does that very badly, actually, at the end, so that it doesn't make sense in parts anymore. But he is rewriting his stories, publishing them over and over again, because his publisher asks him to, not forces him to, but there's opportunities. Karl May was not as many of you may know, not a very successful person until he actually became a writer. He had spent time in jail. He had for fraud, and he was a failed teacher and so forth. So he stuck to what he was good at, and he was good at creating stories and making stories. But at the same time, I'm certain that he had this idea about himself, or that he thought he was an idealist, and that he was an idealist, and that he wanted to do something for the vanishing race, the Red Indian, the noble savage, to at least create an image that is resonating with the past and goes into the future, that is remembering the good Indian, that they were good Indians. But it also has a political angle. It has the angle that he is a German in a certain period of time, that he is creating the Germans as the better colonial powers, the better colonizers, the benevolent people, the more civilized, because they are sending their engineers who actually can talk to the people, understand the people, and make the people understand. Winnetou's teacher, Clicky Petra, actually is a German. So, the first contact Winnetou has with Germany is not through Old Shatterhand, but through his teacher, a person who goes to the Native Americans, to the Apaches, and becomes a teacher there by going native.
How are his other novels but in comparison to the success of those, because we have a whole shelf out here as our exhibit. So how do those, compare, or, the success of those?
I think that the Winnetou novels were the most successful of the novels. I don't have the numbers, I admit. And as I said before in the very beginning, I never liked the other stories. I never liked the stories in the Orient. That doesn't resonate with me. I like the Indian stories. That's what I liked. And I received a number of his books as presents from Hachi Aleph Omar and what have you, or Karabinensi, that was his character. And I read half through that book and I didn't like it. I never finished the book. It's still at home, unfinished.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.